Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on Splunk Business Flow. Just to let you know, my name is Paul Winchester. I'm one of Somerford's PS consultants. I specialize in general IT ops, ITSI, and now Business Flow, which is a interesting, fairly new product from Splunk, and yeah, it gives a very different angle and perspective on your data compared to other Splunk products. So definitely something a bit different, and some real opportunities to look at your business information in a different way. So I'll just get started. So first question, what is Business Flow? So Splunk describes Business Flow as a process mining solution that provides transparency into actual end-to-end digital business processes and customer experience. So, okay, what does that really mean? Process mining is an approach to automated business process analysis that discovers patterns and calculates performance measures. And the great thing about that is it does it for you. So whatever your business process design might be, whatever your IT department tells you should be happening, what this will do is tell you what's actually occurring. Now, the sorts of journeys that we're interested in, the types of journeys that might suit a business flow solution, are things like a customer moving through a retail website, for example. You track them through their session ID or their user ID, and you'll be able to see the steps that they're taking as they pass through your systems. Likewise, perhaps a invoice passing through a financial system. So lots of different sorts of applications, but the key thing is some sort of consistent ID that's going to take you through your various different systems, front-end systems, middleware, back-end systems, whatever they might be. If you've got a consistent ID that can be pulled out from your data, then that is going to help tie everything together. And this sort of flow that you're seeing on the screen is the sort of output you'll get in Business Flow. So yeah, just to recap on that, so it takes your log information collected by Splunk, and if you're already familiar with Splunk, you'll know that Splunk aggregates and collects your log information from different sources, allows you to see that data and drill through it and cut and slice it however you need to. So that log information is collected by Splunk and automatically builds a flow such as the one you see on the screen using unique identifiers in the data. And that flow represents your actual step-by-step processes without any specialist knowledge, without having to bring in SMEs, BAs, whatever. This will just pull it out automatically. The only manual inputs you need are the setup where you're linking your identifiers from different systems to match up across them and produce this. So once you've built a flow, what are you going to do with it? Well, you can see on screen here, we've got different areas of the screen which allow you to organize and present this data in different ways. Across the top, we've got an A/B comparison that allows you to display your flow in one way and then choose different options, display it in another way and compare them side by side. We have the different time options. If you're familiar with Splunk, this will look very familiar as well. All the different types of ways of looking at your data over time. At the moment, we've got it set to all time just to make sure we can see everything, but usually you would cut that down. Similarly, up here, we've got different modes. Quick mode, just allowing you to have a quick overview. And again, we're in complete mode here in order to make sure we can see everything, but usually you'd run it in quick or standard mode. And then down the right-hand side, a few details here to note. So journey steps. You can see these numbers. So this is, I should have said at the start, this is the passage that passengers rather take through an airport, the steps they go through. So you've got 3,441 entering the departure hall, and all the way through they go through security, they go into the dining and duty-free and frequent flyer lounges, and eventually board the plane and depart, with a few departing before going through security or into that area at all, because presumably they're dropping off friends and family. So this shows you at the moment the journey step count, how many people are passing through each of these nodes. You can do an absolute step count, which in this case works out much the same. If you, for example, had a loop where you repeated steps in a journey, then that would be shown there as the absolute step count would be higher than the journey step count. And you can remove that. And you can also look at the average duration of each step. Now, this is quite interesting. In this case, you can see how long, on average, people are spending in different areas. So frequent flyer lounge, nearly an hour. Dining area, likewise, nearly an hour. And it's worth noting that the thickness of the arrows that connect these nodes on this flow indicate the strength, if you like, the frequency of that step. So we'll switch that back to none, but those are all interesting options. And then down the left-hand side, you have all of the different variables, all the different options that you can adjust. We also have a series of alternative views. So this is the flow. This is the kind of primary visual view, and I'll just actually mention a couple of other features here before I forget. For example, if you wanted to change the positioning of any one of these elements, you could, for example, pull passport control over to the side here. Maybe that's a neater, clearer view for your particular interest. Perhaps we're a bit low on space, so we want to bring these up. Okay, and then drag this up as well. And that makes the view a little bit more compact. Hopefully everyone can see that all right. So yeah, lots of options, lots of flexibility in terms of how you move and present these to suit your particular needs. So really nice visualization, actually, much more dynamic than other Splunk visualizations. And actually in all, the interface is really quite different to anything else you see in Splunk. It's kind of singular in that sense, really quite different from the standard Splunk enterprise view of things. So across the top here, we have a few other options. Now the list isn't going to show you very much. It is literally just a list of all these journeys. Okay, not really a lot to tell you there, but you can, get a feel for the variability in your data and the types of sequences or journeys that are happening. So there's some interest there, interesting ways of looking at the data there as well. You can look at attributes. Now, unfortunately, we're missing one of the key pieces of data here in this test data set, which is a shame, but this would look more like a conventional Splunk dashboard if it had a bit more information in it. It's just a way of seeing how the different pieces of information within your data set are represented. So the piece of information that's unfortunately missing is the gate number, and that would show the 20 or so gates in this data set and their frequency. And again, yeah, it looks more like a conventional Splunk dashboard at that point. Conversion rate. Now I'm going to do a demonstration of this in a bit, but this is one of the more valuable and useful tools within the Business Flow toolkit. It just allows you to see exactly that, is conversion rate for particular processes. Really, I think, very useful and powerful in certain situations. Again, retail web would be a good example, but I think there's quite a lot of other applications for that conversion rate. And as I say, I'll do the demonstration of that in a moment. And then finally, metrics. Again, more of a conventional Splunk dashboard in its look and feel. And it's worth mentioning that all of these options update as you adjust the settings down this left-hand side. So I'll hopefully show you that as we're going through that demonstration shortly. So yeah, another kind of dashboard style view of what's going on. So the real meat of this is in these options down the left-hand side. Let me just zoom in again a bit, make sure we can see that properly. Yeah, that's okay. So we have 9 options down the left-hand side here. Top clusters. So these are the most common journeys taken through this system, whatever that system might be. As in this case, we've got passengers moving through an airport or people moving through an airport. And actually saying that the most popular cluster is entering the departure hall and leaving the departure hall, which actually isn't particularly interesting in this case, but it does tell you that as a percentage, that is the most common activity happening within this flow. So as I mentioned before, this is likely people dropping off friends and family at the airport before heading home themselves. And in fact, we'll show later that when calculating the average journey time, as shown up here, that is actually skewing the results, and that will be a useful demonstration later. So I'll come back to that in a bit. So yeah, you can highlight any one or combination of these common journeys. If you want to have a look at what your most common journeys are. Now, one feature that just occurs to me would be nice perhaps would be to have the rarest journeys. There are occasions where you want to see the outliers rather than the most common. So that may be a feature we can suggest for later. Let me reset that. So that's our top clusters. Now, attributes, this is where things aren't quite right, but we saw before under this tab up here, it's essentially the same information being presented. These are the different locations that these activities are taking place, and you can see if I click back to here, the same information being shown here. And if I just select one of those, it doesn't change that, which makes sense. Now think about it. So yeah, that's one of the attributes. The piece of information we're missing is the gate. The gate number here would allow you to select that and see how frequently each of those gates is being used as part of the journeys we're seeing. So that is attributes, and usually in a more complex flow you would see more attributes in there that give you more options. This is quite a simple one. And this is particularly useful here, the steps. So this shows all the different steps in the process, and you can see their frequency, and this really allows you to start manipulating what you're seeing in terms of the flow and starting to work with it. So I mentioned before that this average duration, how long do people spend on average going through this process? Well, we've identified this outlier here, leaving the departure hall pretty much as soon as they've come in, and we realize that these aren't passengers, these are people who are not involved, so we want to remove that because that is going to be skewing our results. So here's our option, leaving departure hall, and if I click on the minus sign there, you'll see that that whole arm of the flow has now been removed, and now we can see what's left. Let me zoom in again. There we go. So things have got a little complicated down here, but I think maybe a little bit of twisting and turning, we can tidy that up. There we go, that looks a bit better. Yeah, so we can now see that that time has gone from 2.8 hours to 3.2 hours average duration. So we can say that that is a more accurate representation of how long users are actually spending in the airport. So immediately quite a quick and simple demonstration there of how that works. And essentially you can do the opposite. So if, for example, this data is coming from an American airport, so you can see here we've got passport control, but not every journey goes through passport control. You've got 637 journeys there, and you've got over 3,000 coming through security. So we can assume that passport control means that these are international flights, whereas those that are not using passport control are internal flights within the US. So if we were to force passport control to be part of our flow, we would now get data just for international flights, and we can then analyze that and say, again, overall average duration is now a little bit higher, which is what you'd expect, because you've had to go through passport control. If I was to change that round the opposite way, you can see that our average duration has dropped a little bit as a result. So yeah, that's a very useful way of cutting up this data quickly to see what the impact is of different steps within the process. Okay, so journey duration is pretty much what you'd expect it to be, showing you the histogram essentially of the different journey times, and you can adjust the size of those histogram columns according to whatever you need. That's possibly a little bit more accurate now. So another piece of information there, another way of analyzing your data. And path duration works in a similar way, showing you how long a particular path within this process takes. So if, for example, we were interested in how long it took to leave security and actually get to boarding the aircraft, let's see if we can do that. So we leave the security check and we board the aircraft. And let's move that up to, say, 10-minute blocks. Yeah, there we go. So that's giving you quite an interesting variation in the data there that you could then go on and analyze further. So whenever you've finished with a particular setting that you're changing, you can simply clear it and move on. Now, occurrence. I'll be honest, this one I've not found a use for yet, so I'm going to skip this one. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly how that works, so I'll leave that and come back to it. And start time. Start time, a little bit like journey duration, is simply showing you how the data that we're currently interested in is represented in terms of start times. On the 24-hour clock as shown here. Possibly more relevant for a situation like this where different times of day may show different journey time patterns. That's something else that you can use in conjunction with other options such as the steps up here. Now, start and end. Start and end with this particular flow simply means starting here and finishing here. So starting with entering the departure hall and finishing with boarding the aircraft, because those are the only start and finish points on this particular flow. Or maybe leaving the departure hall actually counts as another option as well. So that doesn't tell us very much. With a different type of flow, you may have multiple entry points into your flow and multiple exit points, and that will allow you to identify those flows that start and finish with particular entry and exit points. So this particular flow only has one, maybe two, so that doesn't tell us very much about that in particular. And finally, we've got followed by. So this allows you to identify flows that start and finish at particular points. So let's say we want to go for leaving security check. So leave security check. And then we move on to, at some point, eventually going into the enter duty-free area. And it will then refresh all the journeys that include those steps somewhere in their path. That's something you can use for, again, splitting up your flow in such a way as to answer particular questions you might have, which leads me on to questions. So what sort of questions can we answer with business flow? Well, we've seen quite a few examples as I've stepped through. So what I'm going to do now is attempt to do some specific question answering. The first one I have on my list is the average duration of journeys before and after removing non-passengers. So we already saw that. If we take out the step leaving the departure hall, we've currently got an average duration of 2.8 hours. And we take out leaving the departure hall, and that goes up to 3.2 hours. So that's a quick demonstration of that sort of effect. Then again, with the average duration for domestic versus international flights. So passport control, this is an international flight. Now this is where we can use an A-B comparison as well. So if I press this button and recenter my flow, you can see we have two versions of the flow now, both the same, but this one I'm now going to change. So I'm going to remove passport control and force that to basically demonstrate what an internal flight would look like. And now we can see side by side what these two flows look like and how they differ. So our internal flight average is 2.7 hours duration for passengers passing through the airport, and for international flights it's 3.3 hours. So a fairly significant difference there. But yeah, nice side by side comparison. You can use that with any of these options down the left to do that, to look at how those flows differ between two sets of options. So just close that up again and reset that. Okay. So that's average journey duration. Conversion rate. Now I mentioned this before. I said I was going to come back and demonstrate it. This is a particularly nice demonstration of what business flow can do. So what I've got here is, let's say you wanted to see how many passengers visited the dining area after going to the frequent flyer area. Okay, so let's say we're going to say let's leave the frequent flyer lounge and enter the dining area. Okay, so we can see there immediately 64.8% of passengers that went through left the frequent flyer lounge went on to enter the dining area. And you can take that further by adding another step. So if we then want to say, okay, who then went on from the dining area to, let's say, duty free? Did we get any there? No, we didn't. So that's interesting. We have nobody went on to duty free after entering the dining area. Perhaps we want to do it the other way around. So there they are entering the duty free. Do they then go on to the dining hall? So enter the dining area. Yes. So that order does happen more frequently, or it does happen at all, whereas the other way around it doesn't. So you're learning there in this particular case about passenger behavior within this airport, but in obviously another context, you could be learning more about either user behavior within your systems or data behavior in terms of, for example, how your software is behaving. And that's another kind of use case that I'll come back to in a bit. So I think, yeah, that's probably a fairly broad, quick demonstration of the kind of different capabilities that Business Flow has. So I guess the question then is, well, what types of use cases are there for this? I've talked a bit about user experience and users passing through a website, something like an invoice passing through, or an order passing through a warehouse might be another example. So yeah, what types of other operations outside of those? Well, there's a couple of other situations that I've thought of that I can see where this would be useful. If I just go back to the main flow diagram here. Let's say you had a development of a new piece of software that needs to plug into what you're already using. You wanted to see what the impact of that would be. So in your test environment, you would bolt in your new tool, and you could see how the processes are affected by that new tool. You can look at those sorts of average durations, average activities, but you could also look at specific journeys. You might find, for example, that there's a couple of journeys that get very long. Normally a journey might take 10 steps, and suddenly you're getting a few journeys that are taking 100 steps. Well, what's going on there? Well, it might be that your new code has introduced some looping, some issues of that nature where something's getting stuck in a loop, and that could help you identify that problem. Splunk Business Flow sits on exactly the same platform. If you've already got data in Splunk, and it meets the sort of criteria that it needs for business flow, then absolutely we can use that. Couple of things to note there. So as you say, it's ingested in exactly the same way. Forwarder, index, search headers doing the driving on this. You need an ID of some sort, as I mentioned at the start, but it doesn't have to be consistent. The ID has to be consistent between systems, but the field name doesn't have to be consistent. There's a process for linking different IDs up. That essentially says that in this system, the ID you're interested in is called X, in this system it's called Y, in this system it's called Z. So that's one part of the setup, but it's very simple. It's literally a checkbox screen. It's very straightforward. The other piece of information that you need, which just requires probably a little bit of extra work, but really not very much, is actually identifying what these steps are. So for example, here it says enter security lane. Well, how do you know that piece of data is representing entering a security lane? You're going to have to add some metadata to say that this source is giving you that particular step, that particular action within the system. So that's one extra piece of work that sometimes may need to be done just to identify how you want to label that particular step in your process, in your journey, or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, the key thing there is, yeah, it uses exactly the same architecture that we would use for any other Splunk installation. It sits on top. And apart from that extra metadata, doesn't really require anything extra to be done to it. There's a little bit of configuration to do here, but it's actually very simple and quick, and doesn't require a huge amount of specialist knowledge on the client side. We need SMEs to be able to identify where in the data to find IDs, but other than that, it is pretty straightforward. That's really about it. The other thing I would say is I'm an ITSI specialist, so my question to myself is, well, how would we fit this with something like ITSI? How would we how we look at it, or how we compare the two products, because they're kind of maybe occupying a similar sort of space, but they're really looking at data in a fundamentally different way. And the way I've sort of been thinking about it is that in ITSI, which is Information Technology Service Intelligence, that is looking at aggregated information about services, but at an aggregated level. So you're looking at things being brought together, data being brought together to give you health scores that are driving that mechanism. And it's very much a kind of average state. So, for example, you may have a service that is identified as healthy because it meets all its KPIs, and all the KPIs are green. Everything's happy, but there may still be some smaller scale problems going on there that you can't see. There may be one or two users or processes that are failing, but they're not enough to trigger a health warning, a alert in that system. But if you were looking at that journey here, you may well see that sort of loop, perhaps, that I was talking about earlier, where the user has got stuck or going round and round circles or some sort of problem like that. You may see those more edge case scenarios here that you wouldn't see in a tool like ITSI. So I think they're very much complementary tools. Um, Business Flow gives you a much more user-centric view of things. I think it's much more you get to see how all your systems work together, whereas tools like ITSI are more interested in how they're behaving, as a whole. So yeah, very interesting product. Something I'm certainly excited to get to grips with and start getting users, getting clients working on this, because I think there's a huge amount of potential here, and a lot of it comes down to how we can sort of imagine using this information to slice and dice the data and get real insight into business processes. So yeah, it's not in itself a particularly difficult rather thing to do. It's more to do with understanding the data that you're doing it with to make sure that that's being done appropriately. It's just trying to think the best way to explain it. Yeah, I think on the whole, I'd probably prefer an admin to be doing that side of things, but it's certainly not something that has to be done by somebody with that level of Splunk experience and access. It can be done by power users under the right circumstances. Hopefully that's been a useful demonstration, and of course, please come back to us with anything further. As I said, my name is Paul Winchester. Here at Somerford Associates, and specializing in this sort of area, IT ops, DevOps. So any questions at all, please get in touch with us. Look forward to hearing from you and seeing what we can do with this.